The B-17 Flying Fortress descended through the gray Dutch sky at 200 feet, so low that Oberst Wilhelm Hartmann could see the pilot's face through the cockpit glass. The metallic drone of engines mixed with the wet squelch of boots in muddy polders, the sharp smell of aviation fuel cutting through the stench of rotting turnips that had sustained the starving population of Amsterdam through the winter of 1944 to 45. This moment would shatter everything German military doctrine had taught about enemy priorities and reveal an industrial abundance that made Nazi propaganda look like children's fairy tales. April 29, 1945. The Western Netherlands writhed in the grip of the hunger winter, where Dutch civilians survived on 364 calories per day, boiling sugar beets and tulip bulbs to ward off starvation. German authorities had maintained iron control over the occupied territory, but now Allied bombers approached at altitudes so low that anti-aircraft guns couldn't depress far enough to engage them. The sound was wrong for a bombing run. These aircraft flew with deliberate slowness, their bomb bay doors gaping open not to release death, but something incomprehensible. Sacks tumbled from the bellies of Lancaster bombers and B-17 Flying Fortresses, splitting open as they struck the frozen ground. White flour cascaded across muddy fields, tins of corned beef scattered like metallic confetti. And then came the items that broke German minds. Chocolate bars wrapped in bright paper, 4 packs of American cigarettes, and tins of coffee that released aromatic clouds when torn open by desperate hands. Hartmann, a veteran of 3 campaigns who had witnessed the mechanized efficiency of German logistics, stood transfixed as Operation Manna unfolded before him. In his concealed diary, discovered decades later in the Bundesarchiv, he wrote, "The Americans dropped food like we dropped bombs. Endless quantities, without thought of cost. Each sack contains enough chocolate to supply our entire regiment for a week. They waste plane sorties on candy bars, while we can barely supply ammunition." The psychological warfare was devastating. The crowds of Dutch civilians who surged across the drop zones moved with the urgency of the starving, but their faces registered something beyond hunger relief. They had witnessed impossible abundance falling from enemy aircraft. Children who hadn't tasted sugar in 6 months bit into Hershey bars and wept. Women clutched 4 packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes, worth more than gold in the black market economy of occupied Europe. But the German observers understood the deeper message. These weren't emergency rations scraped together from military surplus. The packages bore the crisp printing of U.S. Army Field Ration K on cardboard boxes designed for mass production. The cigarettes came in pristine commercial packaging. The chocolate bars showed no signs of rationing or shortages, their wrappers bright with peacetime advertising graphics that seemed to mock the gray austerity of the Third Reich. The smell of home. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, positioned in a Wehrmacht observation post overlooking the Haarlemmermeer polder, watched through binoculars as American crews completed their 3rd sortie of the day. His report, filed with Army Group H headquarters and preserved in the German Federal Archives, contained a single devastating observation. Enemy aircraft waste valuable fuel and cargo space on luxury items for their own troops while conducting humanitarian operations. This suggests unlimited logistical capacity. The numbers told a story that shattered Nazi assumptions about American weakness. Operation Manna alone would involve 3,301 sorties, delivering 7,142 tons of supplies. The American component, Operation Chowhound, would add another 2,268 sorties and 3,770 tons. Together, the operations represented more airlift capacity than the Luftwaffe could muster for combat missions at this stage of the war. German quartermaster officers who examined captured K-ration boxes discovered industrial standardization that exposed the mythology of American disorganization. Each daily ration contained not just nutritional necessities, but calculated morale boosters. A 4-pack of commercial cigarettes in every supper unit, a 2-ounce chocolate bar, and coffee of higher quality than German officers had seen since 1939. What kind of military machine included candy bars in its basic logistics? The question haunted German strategic thinking as reports filtered up the chain of command. Wehrmacht intelligence had spent years analyzing American industrial capacity, but the evidence now falling from the sky suggested calculations so far off the mark that entire strategic assumptions required revision. The enemy wasn't just winning the war of production. They were winning it with such overwhelming superiority that luxury items traveled in bomb bays alongside humanitarian aid. As Hartmann watched Dutch families share chocolate among children who had forgotten the taste of sweetness, he began to understand that Germany faced an opponent operating from principles completely alien to Nazi ideology. The Americans dropped food not from weakness or sentimentality, but from the casual confidence of inexhaustible strength. The sound of approaching engines announced another wave of bombers, flying so low that their prop wash scattered the torn paper wrappings of 1,000 chocolate bars across the flooded fields. What Hartmann couldn't know was that this demonstration of American abundance would prove more decisive than any military victory, converting enemy observers into witnesses of a power that made conquest irrelevant. But the true shock was yet to come. The crinkle of cellophane chocolate wrappers punctuated the silence of Amsterdam's Vondelpark as German Hauptmann Ernst Weber watched starving Dutch children trade scraps of Hershey bar for information about hidden food caches. The metallic tang of spring rain mixed with the yeasty aroma of fresh-dropped American flour, while torn burlap sacks leaked precious coffee grounds into puddles that Dutch civilians scooped up with their bare hands. Weber was witnessing the collapse of an economic system built on scarcity, replaced overnight by evidence of limitless American industrial capacity. May 2, 1945, the third day of combined operations, had transformed the occupied Netherlands into a laboratory of psychological warfare conducted not through bullets, but through butter. German forces, ordered to cooperate with the humanitarian drops to avoid civilian massacre, found themselves facilitating their own strategic education. Wehrmacht personnel laid out white bedsheets to mark drop zones, inspected sacks to ensure no weapons were smuggled inside, and watched in stunned silence as American abundance rained from the sky. The logistics defied German comprehension. Quartermaster reports preserved in the Wehrmacht archives documented the mathematical impossibility of what they witnessed. A single B-17 carried cargo worth more than a German battalion's monthly supply allocation. The aircraft appeared in formations of dozens, sometimes hundreds, executing precision drops that demonstrated navigational accuracy exceeding anything the Luftwaffe had achieved at its peak. But the contents of American K-ration boxes provided the most devastating intelligence. Weber's detailed inventory, discovered in his personal papers in 1987, revealed the bureaucratic precision behind American abundance. Each field ration contains 1 4-pack commercial cigarettes, Lucky Strike or Chesterfield brands, 1 chocolate bar, Hershey or D-ration emergency, coffee powder, canned meat, crackers, and accessories. The packaging quality exceeds our officer mess standards. The waste of materials suggests unlimited manufacturing capacity. The cigarettes alone represented strategic intelligence that penetrated to the heart of Nazi ideology. German soldiers received 6 cigarettes per day when supplies allowed, often settling for ersatz tobacco mixed with sawdust and dried leaves. American frontline troops carried multiple 4-packs as standard equipment, using cigarettes not just for personal consumption, but as currency for interactions with civilians and captured personnel. Currency of the victorious. Oberleutnant Hans Richter, intelligence officer with the 15th Army, filed reports that read like documents from an alien civilization. American aircrews, he noted, sometimes threw additional packages from aircraft during low passes over German positions. Not propaganda leaflets, but actual care packages containing chewing gum, extra chocolate bars, and cigarette cartons that landed within Wehrmacht perimeters. The tactical implications were staggering. These weren't desperate armies scraping together final reserves. These were military forces so confident in their supply lines that they literally threw luxury items at their enemies. German soldiers who retrieved the packages discovered commercial-grade chocolate that triggered physical reactions in men who hadn't tasted sugar in months. Medical officers reported cases of refeeding sickness as starving personnel consumed rich foods too quickly, collapsing from electrolyte shock after eating fatty rations designed for well-nourished troops. The sensory assault continued beyond nutrition. American K-ration boxes, printed with crisp graphics, reading U.S. Army Field Ration K, became prized artifacts among German collectors. The cardboard itself was superior to anything German civilians had seen since peacetime, while the internal packaging demonstrated industrial capabilities that made German ersatz materials look primitive. Soldiers used the boxes as makeshift plates, stoves, and storage containers, marveling at the quality of what Americans discarded as routine packaging. The smell haunted German positions for weeks. The dense, slightly bitter aroma of derationed chocolate could cut through the metallic reek of motor oil and wet wool in damp bivouacs. Veterans described the fragrance as the smell of home, but for German observers, it became the smell of defeat. Not the dramatic defeat of battlefield collapse, but the quiet, inexorable defeat of an economy that couldn't match enemy luxury with its own necessities. Dutch reception of the drops provided additional psychological warfare. German observers watched civilians run across frozen polders to gather American supplies, their faces transformed by tastes they'd forgotten during the hunger winter. Children who had survived on boiled tulip bulbs bit into chocolate bars and experienced sensory overload that manifested as tears, laughter, or temporary collapse. The visual contrast was devastating. Mud-spattered Wehrmacht uniforms beside bright American cigarette packages that glinted under weak spring sunlight. The theological implications weren't lost on German command. Operation Manna's name deliberately evoked the biblical miracle of food falling from heaven, but the reality exceeded religious metaphor. This was industrial miracle, the materialization of abundance from an economy that treated luxury items as standard military logistics. German chaplains reported soldiers questioning whether divine providence favored the enemy, while intelligence officers struggled to explain American waste in terms that fit Nazi economic theory. Weather delays provided additional humiliation. American operations were postponed not by enemy action or supply shortages, but by fog at British airfields that prevented optimal visibility for precision drops. The assumption of perfect conditions for humanitarian operations revealed logistical confidence that German forces hadn't possessed even at the height of their power. American planners could afford to wait for ideal weather because their supply chains operated with margins that rendered timing concerns irrelevant. The ground coordination mechanisms exposed German military effectiveness as theatrical performance. Wehrmacht personnel who inspected drop zones for weapons soon realized they were facilitating their own strategic education. Every white bedsheet marked another demonstration of American abundance. Every opened sack revealed another impossibility. Industrial chocolate in a continent starved for sugar, commercial cigarettes in a Europe desperate for tobacco, coffee of higher quality than German generals had tasted since the war began. But the most devastating revelation was yet to unfold in the testimonies of those who tasted American abundance firsthand. How could an ideology built on scarcity and struggle survive contact with enemies who threw away more food than entire German divisions received? The answer would emerge in the confessions of Wehrmacht personnel, who began to understand that they faced not just a more powerful enemy, but representatives of a completely different economic universe, where abundance rendered conquest unnecessary and luxury items traveled in the bomb bays of humanitarian missions. General Major Friedrich von Seckendorf collapsed to his knees in a muddy Dutch field, vomiting uncontrollably after consuming half a Hershey bar found in an American supply drop. The rich sweetness, alien to a digestive system, adapted to ersatz coffee and turnip soup, triggered violent refeeding sickness that would hospitalize dozens of Wehrmacht personnel in the following days. Around him, the wet thud of supply sacks hitting frozen ground mixed with the mechanical drone of departing B-17s, while the buttery aroma of tinned American pastry overwhelmed air that had smelled of coal smoke and boiled rutabaga for 6 months. This moment marked the precise instant when Nazi ideology collided with the physical reality of American industrial supremacy and shattered on contact. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're finding this as fascinating as I am, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible untold stories from history. May 4th, 1945. The refeeding crisis had begun to overwhelm German medical facilities as Wehrmacht personnel and Dutch civilians consumed American rations designed for well-nourished troops. German army physicians, trained to treat combat wounds and infectious diseases, found themselves facing a medical phenomenon that exposed the depth of European starvation. Patients arrived at aid stations not from enemy fire, but from eating chocolate too quickly after months of subsistence-level nutrition. The medical reports, preserved in Oberkommando der Wehrmacht files, documented symptoms that read like accounts of poisoning, severe cramping, electrolyte imbalances, and cardiovascular stress triggered by sudden exposure to fats and sugars. What American soldiers consumed routinely as field rations proved literally toxic to digestive systems adapted to wartime scarcity. Dr. Klaus Brenner, Chief Medical Officer of the 88th Infantry Division, recorded the most detailed account of the phenomenon. The enemy chocolate produces violent physical reactions in our personnel. The fat content exceeds anything our men have consumed in 2 years. 3 soldiers required cardiac monitoring after eating American candy bars. The implications for our nutritional status are more devastating than any intelligence report. The psychology of abundance proved even more destructive than its physiology. German officers who witnessed the drops began displaying symptoms that field psychiatrists couldn't classify using existing medical terminology. Veterans of Stalingrad and Normandy, men who had faced mechanized death without breaking, experienced nervous collapse when confronted with American waste. The sight of perfectly edible food discarded for minor cosmetic flaws, the casual disposal of half-eaten chocolate bars, the endless streams of luxury items falling from enemy aircraft. It triggered cognitive dissonance that manifested as depression, rage, and spiritual crisis. Oberst Wilhelm Hartmann's diary entries, discovered in 1973 during renovation of his family estate, documented the progression of psychological breakdown. May 5th, watched American crews toss extra cigarette cartons from aircraft during low passes. Our men scramble for discarded luxury items like beggars. The humiliation is complete. May 6th, found German soldier sharing single D-ration bar among 5 men, shaving corners with helmet rim. American abundance has reduced us to scavengers in our own occupied territory. May 7th, can no longer maintain illusion of German superiority. We fight with ersatz materials while enemies waste real coffee. The war was lost the moment their chocolate fell from our sky. The cigarette economy revealed the most devastating intelligence about American capabilities. German personnel discovered that American frontline troops used tobacco not just for personal consumption, but as universal currency. A single 4-pack from a K-ration could purchase information from civilians, services from prisoners, or cooperation from hostile populations. The casual deployment of cigarettes as diplomatic tools suggested logistical depth that made German strategic calculations meaningless. The economics of overwhelming victory. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, whose black market connections had sustained his unit through the winter of 1944, found his entire economic worldview inverted by American supply practices. In his post-war testimony to Allied intelligence, he described the psychological impact of witnessing systematic waste. They discarded more cigarettes in one day than we could acquire in 6 months of trading. Fresh packs thrown from jeeps, half-smoked cigarettes stubbed out carelessly, cartons used as packing material for other supplies. The abundance was magnificent and terrible. We knew then that we faced an enemy operating from principles we couldn't comprehend. The German interpretation of American motivation revealed the complete failure of Nazi intelligence analysis. Wehrmacht reports consistently describe the drops as propaganda operations designed to demoralize German forces and win Dutch civilian cooperation. The possibility that Americans might conduct humanitarian operations from genuine abundance never appeared in official assessments because such abundance couldn't exist within Nazi economic theory. The failure to understand American motivation reflected deeper conceptual limitations. German strategic thinking, shaped by concepts of Lebensraum and resource competition, couldn't process evidence of an economy that treated luxury items as routine military logistics. The Americans weren't conquering territory to acquire resources. They possessed resources in such quantities that conquest became unnecessary. Local German commanders faced an impossible choice: allow the drops to continue and witness daily demonstrations of enemy superiority, or attempt to prevent humanitarian operations and face civilian uprising in territory already difficult to control. Most chose collaboration, laying out marking sheets and inspecting supply packages while filing reports that read like suicide notes for Nazi ideology. The sensory memory of American abundance haunted German positions long after the drops ended. The smell of chocolate lingered in muddy fields for weeks, a constant reminder of enemy capabilities. German soldiers assigned to police the drop zones reported psychological symptoms that included obsessive thoughts about American food, involuntary salvation at the sound of aircraft engines, and recurring dreams about infinite supplies of coffee and cigarettes. The children's reactions provided the most devastating propaganda imagery. Dutch boys and girls who had survived the hunger winter on boiled tulip bulbs experienced sensory overload when exposed to American chocolate. Photographers captured images of small hands grasping candy bar wrappers, faces transformed by tastes forgotten during months of starvation. The pictures appeared in underground newspapers across occupied Europe, visual proof that liberation meant not just freedom from oppression, but access to abundance that rendered Nazi promises of prosperity pathetic lies. The taste of American chocolate became the taste of German defeat. German guards, watching Dutch civilians share chocolate among their children, began to question everything they had been told about racial superiority, economic systems, and the justification for conquest. If the enemy could afford to drop luxury items on starving populations while simultaneously conducting the largest military operations in human history, what did that say about the 1,000-year Reich that couldn't supply basic nutrition to its own troops? The question would destroy the last vestiges of Nazi faith among those who witnessed American abundance firsthand. But the final revelation, the discovery of what American soldiers actually ate on the front lines, would prove even more devastating to German morale. The final B-17 disappeared into the gray sky above Schiphol Airport on May 8, 1945, its empty bomb bays having delivered the last of 11,000 tons of American and British supplies to the starving Netherlands. In the sudden silence that followed 6 months of mechanical thunder, General Major Heinrich von Wiedinghoff stood among the scattered debris of chocolate wrappers and empty cigarette packs, understanding with crystalline clarity that Germany had not merely lost a war, it had been defeated by an economic system so superior that military conquest became an obsolete concept. The aftermath of Operations Manna and Chowhound would reshape European understanding of American power more profoundly than any battlefield victory, proving that the ultimate weapon was not destruction, but the capacity to create abundance. The mathematical reality of the operations destroyed German strategic thinking at its foundations. Over 8 days, Allied aircraft had flown 5,569 sorties, delivering more humanitarian aid than the Wehrmacht had moved in combat supplies during the entire Battle of the Bulge. The logistical precision exceeded anything German forces had achieved even at the height of their power, while the casual waste of aircraft fuel and crew hours on luxury items revealed resource margins that made Nazi calculations meaningless. German intelligence officers attempting to process the operations filed reports that read like confessions of intellectual bankruptcy. How could an enemy simultaneously conduct the largest amphibious invasion in history, maintain supply lines across 2 oceans, and still possess surplus capacity for humanitarian missions that included chocolate bars and cigarette cartons? The question shattered decades of German strategic doctrine built on assumptions of resource competition and zero-sum economics. The post-operation interviews with captured American aircrew provided the final pieces of a puzzle that German commanders couldn't solve. Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez, gunner on a Chowhound mission, explained American motivation in terms that German intelligence found incomprehensible. "We dropped food because we had food. The chocolate and cigarettes were standard K-ration issue. Same stuff we ate every day. Command figured starving people needed calories more than we needed bomb tonnage on that particular mission. No big strategic calculation, just seemed like the decent thing to do." The casualness of overwhelming power. German analysis of captured K-ration components revealed an industrial system operating on principles alien to European experience. The standardization exceeded German peacetime production capabilities. Each ration contained not just nutritional necessities, but calculated psychological boosters manufactured by civilian companies operating at full capacity during wartime. Lucky Strike and Chesterfield cigarettes bore pristine commercial packaging that suggested tobacco rationing either didn't exist or didn't affect military supplies. The chocolate bars displayed quality control standards that German confectioners hadn't maintained since 1938. The bureaucratic precision behind American abundance became a weapon more devastating than any military technology. German quartermasters discovered that U.S. Army regulations required K-ration production to exceed demand by 10% to ensure no soldier went without full rations. The systematic overproduction, designed to prevent supply shortages, generated surplus capacity that Americans deployed for humanitarian operations without reducing military effectiveness. The Dutch civilian response provided intelligence about American soft power that German propaganda ministers had never anticipated. Underground newspapers across occupied Europe published accounts of the drops, describing not just the food itself, but the psychological impact of witnessing enemy abundance. The stories spread through resistance networks, carrying a message more subversive than any political propaganda. The Americans possessed resources in such quantities that they could afford generosity toward conquered populations. The refeeding crisis continued to provide medical evidence of the economic gap between Nazi Germany and Allied nations. German hospitals treated hundreds of cases of nutritional shock as personnel and civilians consumed American rations designed for well-nourished troops. The medical documentation became an inadvertent record of European starvation, preserved in Wehrmacht files that would later serve as evidence in war crimes tribunals. The sensory legacy of the operations haunted occupied Europe for months. The smell of chocolate and coffee lingered in liberated towns, creating olfactory memories that associated American presence with abundance rather than conquest. Children who had survived the hunger winter developed psychological associations between aircraft engines and the promise of food, reactions that would influence European attitudes toward American military presence for decades. The strategic implications transcended immediate humanitarian impact. German commanders realized They faced an enemy that conducted psychological warfare through demonstration rather than propaganda. The Americans didn't need to make claims about their economic superiority. They simply opened their bomb bays and let the evidence fall from the sky. The visual proof was irrefutable. A nation that could waste luxury items on humanitarian missions possessed industrial capacity that rendered military resistance futile. The timing proved devastating to German morale. The drops occurred during the final weeks of Nazi resistance, when Wehrmacht personnel still hoped for negotiated settlement or miraculous reversal. Instead of propaganda promising ultimate victory, they witnessed daily demonstrations of enemy abundance that made continued fighting appear not just hopeless, but absurd. How could an ideology built on struggle and sacrifice compete with an economy that treated luxury items as routine military logistics? The cultural interpretation of American waste revealed the complete failure of Nazi racial theory. German observers had been conditioned to view American abundance as evidence of decadence and weakness. But the systematic deployment of luxury items in combat zones suggested strength so overwhelming that waste became strategy. The Americans could afford to be generous because generosity cost them nothing. They possessed resources in such quantities that humanitarian operations represented rounding errors in their military budget. The post-war testimonies of German officers who witnessed the drops provided historians with detailed accounts of ideological collapse in real time. Veterans of multiple campaigns, men who had maintained Nazi faith through Stalingrad and Normandy, described psychological transformation triggered by the sight of chocolate falling from enemy aircraft. The abundance wasn't just material evidence of American superiority. It was proof that Nazi promises of prosperity through conquest had been pathetic lies. 11,000 tons of ideological demolition. The operations established a template for American soft power projection that would influence Cold War strategy and beyond. The lesson was clear. Overwhelming abundance, deployed with strategic generosity, could accomplish political objectives that military force alone couldn't achieve. The Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift, and decades of American humanitarian interventions would follow the model established over the Netherlands in 1945, using prosperity as a weapon more devastating than any bomb. The German officers who knelt in muddy Dutch fields, vomiting from American chocolate while enemy aircraft dropped luxury items like autumn leaves, had witnessed the future of international relations. They had seen a power that didn't need to conquer territory to acquire resources, because it possessed resources in such abundance that conquest became unnecessary. They had tasted defeat, and it was sweet. In the end, the most devastating weapon in America's arsenal wasn't the atomic bomb or the B-29 superfortress. It was the simple, overwhelming evidence that free societies could create abundance, while totalitarian regimes could only promise it. The German officers who witnessed American chocolate falling from the sky understood, perhaps better than their own leaders, that the war had been lost the moment ideology encountered reality. The chocolate wrappers scattered across liberated Europe became monuments to a truth that would reshape the post-war world. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is simply having enough to share with your enemies.